Yo, 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 yo. What's going on, folks? What's going on? Hopefully, I'm on. I'm checking right now. All right, let's look. Let's look. I got to double check. All right, we got some folks on here. Oh, yeah, that's what I got to do. I'm all unprepared, y'all. Sorry. I'm all unprepared. I got to get on my iPad so I can see who's in. All right, we got some folks coming in. All right, I see. Oh, there we go. Will Brodus is in the house. What's up, big brother? Got Greenville, South Carolina in the house. Good to see you, man. Who else we got up in here? Man, let me know who's in here. The great Baltimore Bishop. Stop it. Who else we got up in here? See it. Hey, Joey's in the house. Melissa T. Laura Rourke. Yo, Joey and Tanya in the house. This is crazy. Keon Upkins, Black Power. All power to the people. All right. Man, I'm so excited to dive into this tonight. Crazy chapter, great chapter. I don't know how far we'll get in the discussion, but hopefully, listen, if you got quotes, comments, anything, please share in the thing so we can engage a little bit. Y'all know we kind of freestyle. Miss Mary Luzelle coming all the way in. Good to see you, Miss Laura. Got Jennifer French in the house. Come on, somebody. Yes, Joey, I am ready for a vacay. It should be here this week, but I'm just praying the Lord give me strength a little longer. Then I'm going to see you, brother. Hey, my favorite mother-in-law. That's right, my favorite mother-in-law, Mary, is in the building, hailing all the way from Wapaka, Wisconsin. You know, love you. And you sent a bunch of stuff to my house today. I don't know if I'm happy or sad about it. I am claiming the Incredible Hulk, though. So I'm just gonna receive that. Trip won't give it to me, but I'll steal it while he's sleeping. So yeah, man. All right, we got Josh Crans in the building. Thanks for coming, brother. All right. Man. Greetings. Hey, Dr. Echo is in the house. Thanks for hanging with me, Dr. Echo. And so I'm so excited. I thought this was a very helpful chapter in light of everything that we got going on right now in our culture. And, especially in light of the discussion around Black Lives Matter. And that's caused a lot of contention. I get a lot of emails, phone calls, text messages, DMs, Instagram DMs. I get it all. And matter of fact, I was just on another call with a church talking about some of this stuff. And it seems to be a lot of contention around these organizations. But I thought Dr. King gave me some insight, some clarity. And it was just dope to just kind of get an inside scoop on just some of these conversations that he was having. And so I'm really excited to kind of dive into it with you guys. All right, got Miss Francis in the house. Jennifer Shirky, good to see you. Thanks for hanging with me. I'm sure Trev, how do I do that? I don't know how to do that, Trev. Gosh, don't be yelling at me on the thing. You know what I'm saying? What you want me to do? What you want me to do? I don't know. So, so I don't know. So we got that going on, and so I'm super excited. about that. So yeah, anything stand out, put it in the comments. You ain't got to type too fast. Oh no, it says something on Facebook. Don't worry about that, Trev. You good. You good, brother. I thought it was yelling at me. So don't I get nervous. So so yeah, anything that stood out this week, listen, I want to tell you, we went in hot. Like this is one page of my situation. There was so much happening on these pages, in these conversations. And so there's a lot that happened in this chapter. I'm super excited to jump in it, talk about it. A lot of underlines, a lot of yelling going on, a lot of just wrestling through some of this. So we're going to try our best to kind of move through this chapter in light of how Dr. King engaged with Black power. So obviously it started out with a very important circumstance where we're looking at James Meredith, the freedom fighter down in Mississippi. And what I thought was so interesting about what Dr. King said about Mississippi being what did I say? Mississippi was just one of those places that many of us have in our mind. Maybe it's because of the movie Mississippi Burning or something. Many of us, African Americans, I've heard this across the board for African Americans, is like Mississippi is like the worst case scenario. If you're driving from Florida to Texas, do not break down to Mississippi because there's like this real fear, there's real tension. They have a reputation. And so we got a lot of this going. All right, I see you, Frank. We got Frank in the building. And so Angelina's in the building. And so this is one of those chapters where it was interesting that this conversation, the Black Power slogan, will be introduced. So obviously James Meredith had been shot, and they go there to kind of corral around him and finish the march that he had started. And just to see, one of the things I thought was really interesting was the camaraderie. There's kind of this community of leaders, and I think a lot of times when we think about activism and so much happening with social media and all of that, it can be easy to forget, like, we need to be in community, going after these transformations, going after these very different things. Yeah, I see. Yeah, man, I can only imagine. Because there's just that kind of stereotype. I know since moving up north, people think the South is bad. Just erase the whole South for Black people. But of course, I would say, nah, there's so much to love about being from the South and living in the South and having my heritage in the South. So we don't want to wipe it off the map. But at the very same time, there's still these stereotypes and there's still this deep history. But to see how they all came in the hospital room and kind of circled him just reminded me of a lot of times those pastors I've been with, those comrades I've had in the past that have come, and like we're in this struggle together. And that was just a reminder to me that, listen, you ain't got to go through this alone. I laughed when they talked about Floyd McKissick, not Floyd McKissick, James Meredith, and how he was kind of a lone ranger doing his own thing, and how they had to negotiate with him to kind of be able to come on his march. But all of that to say, there was something that's interesting. And one of the things I wanted to bring up tonight was there's often this assumption that African Americans could speak for all African Americans. And what I loved about this chapter is it gave insight. So if you're like, man, why do all Black people? Why do all Black people? Why do all Black people? This chapter gives insight that not all Black people agree on stuff because we're not monolithic. Like we have different opinions, different philosophies, different strategies, different ways we would engage with problems in the world. And what I loved about this is it began to show some of those distinctions in the movement, in the civil rights movement. And so I loved that and appreciated that about that. But early on in the chapter, page 25 down to the end, as we walk down the meandering highway in the sweltering heat. There was much talk and many questions were raised. And one of the questions that was raised, that I love it, I'm not for this non-violent stuff anymore. That's hilarious to me because I hear the same thing right now. I'm not for this non-violent stuff anymore, shouted one of the young activists, right? And if one of these damn white Mississippi crackers touches me, I'm going to knock them the hell out. All right, I understand that. All right, so you see that. Later on, a discussion of the composition of the march came up. This should be an all-black march. We don't need any more white phonies and liberals invading our movement. This is our march. And once again, this just shows, listen, African Americans don't have one way of doing things. We have different philosophies. We have different ways that we view these circumstances and situations that we find ourselves in. And therefore, we're trying to find a voice, but we're trying to move in lockstep with one another. But he goes on to say, the voices rang out with all the traditional fervor, the glad thunder and gentle strength that had always characterized the song, We Shall Overcome. But when it got to the part talking about black and white together, the voices of a few of the marchers were muted. And what I marked in my notes right there is I said, man, listen, trauma breeds suspicion. Trauma breeds suspicion. So what is that? What do I mean by that? A lot of times when we're going into these race conversations and questions are being asked, things are being said, African Americans are navigating, and he does a great job of unpacking the trauma. There is suspicion of the other. And it's not because we don't love, and it's not because we don't want a better outcome, but it's because I don't know about this together stuff. I don't know about this unity stuff. And a lot of times I'm reading and I'm seeing pastors, churches, leaders, even posts in Facebook, Instagram. We should just be unified. We should just come together. It don't really matter, all of those things. And I need people to understand we've got to acknowledge the pain that people are feeling because trauma breeds suspicion. And so I talked about that in the group. Talked about kind of how they engage with the We Shall Overcome moment, which I thought was great. They said we should remix it, We Shall Overcome to We Shall Overrun. All right. So that same sentiment still applies today. But what I loved was Dr. King's acknowledgement that he might have been naive about the pain. And he might have been naive about the depth of suspicion and hurt that a lot of African Americans were facing. And he said it this way on page 26. He said, I should have known that in an atmosphere where false promises are daily realities, where deferred dreams are nightly facts, where acts of unpunished violence towards Negroes are a way of life, nonviolence would eventually be seriously questioned. And what I highlighted in that is what he's trying to show us is that this is a culture that Black people have had to navigate. What did he say? I should have known that it was in the atmosphere. This is an atmosphere of what? This is the air we breathe. We breathe the air of false promises. The air, and that's daily we deal with false promises. We deal with dreams being deferred. That happens every night. He talked about where acts of unpunished violence towards Black people are a way of life. That denotes a culture. And so when we talk about systemic racism, when we talk about things having whiteness and white supremacy. Listen, that's we're trying to put words to. We're trying to create a space where you understand. Listen, that this is a culture that has been created, and out of that culture, there's a response, right? When some members, he goes on to talk about Disappointment produces despair, and despair produces bitterness. And the one thing certain about bitterness is its blindness. Another way of saying it is bitterness leads to blindness. So a lot of times I see these conversations where they say, man, Charlie, I need some nuance. I need some, I just keep hearing these blanket statements. And sometimes I hear blanket statements about Black people, how they should act and what they should do. And Black people are saying white people this and white people that, and all of this, rich people this, rich people that, kids that, all millennials that. We make these blanket statements, but he said a lot of times these blanket statements are rooted in a sense of bitterness. It causes a level of blindness. When some members of the dominant group, particularly those in power, are racist in attitude and practice, bitterness accuses the whole group. And that's a powerful reminder that a lot of times when, I remember when I was a bouncer, and yes, I was a bouncer, and yes, I manhandled people on a nightly basis. And so one of those things, when you're a bouncer, you have to be careful with somebody who's in a fight. Somebody that's in a fight, you got to be careful. You can't just run up to somebody who is being attacked and then grab them even for their own good. Why? Because 9 times out of 10, they'll turn around and swing on you or hit you too. And so if you see a person that's on the defensive, that's fighting for their life, is always a better strategy. Me as a bouncer, not wanting to get punched in the face by somebody I'm trying to help, is to stop the person being attacked, stop the aggressor, not the person on the defense. Why? Because of bitterness will accuse the whole group. Because they're bitter, because they're hurt, because it's hard. But in the midst of all of this pain and all of these things, what I loved about Dr. King's response was, it wasn't just to demean these young people. It wasn't just to demean these sentiments. He actually wanted to learn and engage these young people. And he said down at the bottom, and I highlighted it every time it came up, he talked about, I decided that I would plead patiently with my brothers to remain true to the nonviolent, to the time-honored principles of our movement. Plead patiently. Those are 2 words that are hard these days. Those are 2 words that are hard to kind of engage with right now. Simply because, man, I want to get my point across. I want to be right. I'm defending my point. I believe I know what I'm talking about. A lot of these things, but Dr. King sat with college students and members of other Black organizations and decided to plead patiently with them to remain true to time-honored principles. And he said, I began with a plea for nonviolence. Like he's pleading, don't abandon this. Walk with me. Work with me. Let's work this thing out. And it might have been a couple pages later. Yeah, on page 30, he goes on to talk about, for 5 hours long, I pleaded with the group to abandon the Black power struggle, so on and so forth. So yeah, I thought that was just great, man. In these kinds of conversations, we got to plead and be patient with one another. It's hard. So if somebody's hurt, somebody's struggling, somebody's tired right now, listen, I just think today, my God, today, I've had 4 hours of racial conversations. And I'll probably get follow-up phone calls, emails, text messages. And I'm not telling you that to feel bad for me, but what I'm saying is man, in these moments, sometimes you can get aggressive. Sometimes you lose sight. Sometimes, why? Because you feel like you're trying to navigate so many things at one time. But I loved it, man. You got the Deacons of Defense, you had CORE, you had SNCC, you had a lot of different philosophies and strategies. It wasn't just one thing. I loved and appreciated the fact that Dr. King could also navigate the philosophy of nonviolence in a myriad of ways. And that's what we see laid out on page 27. He talks about the necessity of nonviolence confronting the violence of Mississippi. Talked about that at the top. And he talked about the morality of the moment, where I'm not just trying to legislate something, but I'm trying to address the heart, the conscience, so that we are not in this struggle just legally in this struggle, but we're consciously trying to transform and address the heart. And I think a lot of times that gets glossed over. He said, what happens when you pick up the gun? I said, in Mississippi, injustice would not be exposed and the moral issues would be obscured. As soon as you pull out that gun, as soon as you do the things that come natural to you, the moral high ground that we had, the tool by which we would prick people's conscience and get to their heart, we would lose that because people would naturally be filled with violence and rage. He talked about white involvement and the need for it seems counterintuitive for as an African American. Why would this is a black struggle? We're pushing against. There's so much tyranny and oppression, and he goes, man, we gotta have white brothers and sisters in the fight. And what I loved about Dr. King, kind of as a leadership kind of paradigm, is Dr. King was led by principles, not just instinct. He was led by principles and not by instinct. And what I mean by that is, man, our instincts would have us do things that would make us in the moment feel justified and right, but our principles would help us stand and go the distance, whereas our instincts would probably fight, contend, use different tools and means to get to the various ends that would destroy others. And so, man, I was just called back to, man, I need to be a more principle-led leader. So I loved all of that, but I wanted to get deeper into his issues with Black power and the term power, because that's come up a couple of times. I've gotten emails about it. I got people that are fearful, nervous. I got all kinds of talk. And Dr. King's understanding of power and Black power was key and critical in this chapter. So please put your questions, put your comments, anything that stood out to you, please let me know so we can interact on that regard, so I ain't just a talking head up here, because I'd love to hear kind of how y'all were processing and thinking through things. But all of that to say, I love Dr. King's way of addressing Black power, because my own instinct is to say, man, Black power is right. We should affirm that. Like, why can't we use that as a slogan? And Dr. King has some nuanced ideas about it. For people who have been crushed so long by white power and who have been taught that Black was degrading, it had a ready appeal. So a lot of times when we talk about Black power and why you might see a military, like an embracing of, I'm gonna be honest with you. Some days when I'm hurting, some days when I'm tired, some days, I remember when I was going through a crisis when I was 19, I was out of the country. I felt alone. Nobody could really understand why I was struggling. And to be honest with you, because I was so far away from home, I didn't even know why I was struggling. And I remember listening to certain kinds of music. I remember getting heavily influenced by Louis Farrakhan and Malcolm X and various other leaders and various kinds of music. Why? Because it spoke to something in me that I felt had been degraded for so long. And so he goes to explain, it has a ready appeal. I had deep feelings that it was an unfortunate choice of words for a slogan. Moreover, it was bringing about division within the ranks of the marchers. And so it's almost as if Dr. King is like, I know there are things that would make you feel more comfortable in this march, things that would make like you would be able to assert some level of dignity and all of that. But listen, we have a vision that will accomplish what you're looking for without castigating and separating and dividing and fragmenting us. So he goes on to talk about, for 5 long hours, I pleaded with that group to abandon the Black Power slogan. Well, Broder says the discussion of power was good. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love, correcting everything that stands against love. The Black man signing the Emancipation Proclamation in the depths of his own being, MLK has pointed to Black power as a cry for dignity. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because we talked about the semantics piece this week. Go back, check it out. And he goes on to say, man, we do need, he acknowledged Stokely Carmichael. If you don't know Stokely Carmichael, you got to look him up. He's a legend. Stokely replied by saying the question of violence versus nonviolence was irrelevant. The real question was the need for Black people to consolidate power and economic resources to achieve power. Power, he said, is the only thing respected in this world, and we must get it at any cost. And so while that is a reality that power is respected, what you just pointed out, Will, is right. There's a way in which we have to define what we mean by power. We have to define what we mean by power. What's going on, Pastor Leon? Thank you for joining us tonight, brother. Glad you hanging out with us. He goes on to say, no, I'm not denying that we don't need power. I'm saying the way in which we go about getting it is important just as well. We must use every constructive means to amass economic and political power. This is the kind of legitimate power we need. Legitimate power. We must work to build racial pride and refute the notion that Black is evil and ugly. But this must come through a program, not merely through a slogan. And like you, Keon, exactly. These are the exact same arguments. That's why I'm saying, listen, Black folks, white folks, if you reading this, going through this book, it's the exact same arguments. And so that's why I needed Dr. King, because I would want to talk to an OG like this. 50 plus years, same debates within the struggle for freedom for Black Americans. Absolutely. Same arguments. Same arguments. Same rebuttals. Same concessions. Same tensions. Same debates. And so so that was good, man. Love that piece. Talked about the media, that was great. Talked about the media on the page, bottom of page 32. But while the chant died out, the press kept the debate going. So here they've made a compromise within the movement to not take one Freedom Now versus Black Power. They've made a compromise to, put both of those aside and just do the march. But the media comes along while the chant died out. The press kept the debate going. News stories now centered not on the injustices of Mississippi, but on the apparent ideological divisions in the civil rights movement. Sound like something I've seen lately. When we see just one side of the protest, we don't see the peaceful side. We don't see the sides where there's progress being made. We don't see a lot of these things, but you keep seeing these contentious moments being highlighted over and over again. And so we've got to be aware of that as we begin to speak into these situations, especially on social media. Your algorithms are going to speak into some of these situations to make you feel like, oh, there is just tyranny in the streets. There is ideological differences. There's fighting in the camp. When really, there's been conversation. There's been compromise made. But the news story says something different. And I loved it, man. I love that. So we got to be careful, and that's a tool we got to remember that is still being used on us. Because of the decentralization of the justice movement, do you think there's a consistent proposed program? I think you're talking about right in this season right now. Well, to be honest with you, I don't. And I just think there's so much fragmentation and so much philosophical divide right now in this current moment that you don't know which way to go. And many of us are so uneducated, even on the issues in our own city. So we'll get pulled into the police brutality struggle and debate, and we don't we don't know any of the nuances. We'll jump on a hashtag like defund the police and things like that I've seen all this week, abolish the police. We'll jump on stuff like that in the moment, but we don't have any real clarity. Like there's not a centralized kind of clear agenda for a lot of these different things. And of course, we're fighting different fights now. There's been laws that were passed by Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement, but there's different fights and nuances in the fight that I don't think have to be nuanced. I mean, I don't think have to be centralized, but I think we do need some level of clarity as to, okay, what are the initiatives that we need to go after in this moment? It sounds like in 2020, policing and police brutality is one of those areas where a lot of us are putting our energy to say, okay, we need to address this particular thing. All right, let me see. My man Joey said, what did you say, Joey? Let me pull that up. Every drama, there has to be an antagonist and a protagonist. And if the antagonist is not there, the press will find and build one. Man, that's what happens, man. You gotta have a villain. You got to have a villain. Every media outlet has its own bias and its own narrative to proclaim. And so, yeah, that's why I say, man, get it. If you want to get involved in seeing transformation happen, you got to know what's happening at a grassroots level so that you don't get pulled into these narratives that are constructed to get a reaction out of you. And so, man, when I look at Baltimore City and I talk to people that are on the ground, of course, I wish I could protest, but I've got kidney disease, and therefore I'm sitting in my basement praying for all the folks and doing whatever I can, doing stuff like this. But when I talk to men and women that are on the front lines, that are out on the streets, that are walking with people, that are praying and protesting, I'm getting reports from people on the ground saying, Charlie, it was a great night. We saw some things happen. There wasn't any fighting, and the community disarmed a lot of those insiders and all those kinds of things. So I'm getting calls from people in Florida and in Texas or wherever, saying, man, it's crazy in Baltimore. And I'm like, nah, not really. Like, things are going actually pretty well. But because I'm in tune with what's going on the ground, and I haven't taken the media's perspective as the perspective. But I wanted to go even deeper into this Black Power stuff. Yeah, that's right, Sarah. Even where they don't, agenda and anger drives clicks, and clicks equals money. Yeah, that's crazy. That's crazy. And so, man, they feed off of our energy that we give it. And so, man, if we know what's going on the ground, we can hold our journalists accountable to what's actually going on. And so when I look at this, though, I want to dive into this Black Power struggle, because I think it's important for us as African Americans, but also for white people that are wondering, man, like what is really going on behind the scenes? Why is there so much buy-in to this Black Lives Matter movement, and why is there such like impassioned embracing of these things? And I love what Dr. King said, because I think he hit the nail on the head when he said, first, it is necessary to understand that Black power is a cry of disappointment. It's a cry of disappointment. The Black Power slogan did not spring full grown from the head of some philosophical Zeus. It was born from the wounds of despair and disappointment. It is a cry of daily hurt and pain. For centuries, the Negro has been caught in the tentacles of white power. So although you might not hear white power outside of a Ku Klux Klan rally, he's describing the atmosphere, going back to culture. He's describing the culture in which, man, African Americans are so tired of being beat down by incessant reminders of white power. Many Negroes, he says, have given up faith in the white majority because white power with total control has left them empty-handed. So in reality, the call for Black power is a reaction to the failure of white power. So what's he saying? Is he calling everybody a racist? I don't think so. Is he saying that everybody's complicit at the same level? I don't think so. But I believe he is pointing out that there is such a deep hurt and disappointment and discouragement that the white power base, the white supremacy philosophy and ideology that's been codified and legalized, that has created this reaction, this visceral reaction out of African Americans. And so you get these moments where, yes, I want Black power as a direct response to it. And it's funny that they was born in Mississippi. And he goes further to say why Blacks are so angry. He said at the very bottom of the page, in Mississippi, the murder of civil rights workers is still a popular pastime. Think about that. The murder of civil rights worker is a popular pastime. In that state, more than 40 Negroes and whites have either been lynched or murdered over the last 3 years. So think about 1965 to 1964, 65, 66, whatever. In 3 years, we've seen Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd in the last month. Imagine knowing that people had been murdered, over 40 in the last 3 years, and not a single man has been punished for these crimes. More than 50. Imagine this. 50 Negro churches have been burned down or bombed in Mississippi in the last 2 years, yet the bombers still walk streets surrounded by a halo of adoration. So people applauded them for burning down churches, 50 churches. This is white power in its most brutal, cold-blooded, and vicious form. Many of the young people proclaiming Black power today were but yesterday the devotees of Black-white cooperation and nonviolent direct action. And so white silence and white power in their sin of omission, of stepping up and doing and pursuing justice, created enemies out of the ones who were seeking to be peaceful in the street. And we got to see that. You got to see that when you see a young man crying on these TV shows, and you see the women crying, and you see the yelling, and you see the rioting. Man, a lot of this is disappointing. I've tried that, and it seems like they just don't care. It is a response to the feeling that a solution is hopelessly distant because of the inconsistencies, resistance, and faint-heartedness of those in power. If Stokely Carmichael now says that nonviolence is irrelevant, it is because he, as a dedicated veteran of many battles, who laid his life on the line, who may have lost friends and comrades in the struggle for freedom peacefully, nonviolently. It is because he, as a dedicated veteran of many battles, has seen with his own eyes the most brutal white violence against Negroes and white civil rights workers, and has seen it go unpunished. I recently watched a few months ago LA 92 and what happened with Rodney King in the LA riots. And it was interesting because my wife mentioned something, and sometimes we can think of California as this peaceful, hippie, kind of laid back place. And to see those police officers brutally beat Rodney King, and then after a year, after a trial, they go completely free. And then the Black community responded in a riot. And it's funny, this book opens up with a riot of Black people being discouraged and upset because of the inconsistencies, the resistance, and the faint-heartedness. And then it's the minimization of Black life. He goes on to say, the frustration is further fed by the fact that even when Black and whites die together in the cause of justice, the death of the white person gets more attention and concern than the death of a Black person. And page 35, the failure to mention Jimmy Jackson only reinforced the impression that to white America, the life of a Negro is insignificant and meaningless. And at that point, I had to write down Black Lives Matter, right? And so that's what I mean. So many times we say, man, well, why? You know, it's the organization is got all kind of inconsistencies. The organization in the Christian organization, the organization this, that, and the organization that, but I don't talk to me about the what. Talk to me about the why. Why is it that we have to say Black Lives Matter? And so I'm just telling you, this is the tension that we're seeing. I wrote down in the margin, this is why Black people are so angry. That's why they were angry back then. And this is why they're angry right now. There's also great disappointment with the federal government and its timidity. So many times this week, I've gotten phone calls, text messages, emails of leaders, smart, brilliant, leaders that I respect, look up to, honor, who are timid. And what we see in this moment is, you know, that timidity, that fear can cause harm. I know we're timid, but courage is having the ability to move forward and do what is needed to be done, even when I'm fearful, even when I'm timid. And I love it because this ain't just a Southern thing. This is an up north thing. In the northern ghettos, unemployment, housing, discrimination, and slums, schools mocked the Negroes who try to have a little bit of hope. So African Americans across the country, north, south, rural, urban, are all having the same struggle. He goes on to say, all of this represents disappointment lifted to astronomical proportions. It is a disappointment with timid, white moderates who feel they can set the timetable for Negroes' freedom. One of my favorite Dr. King sermons he preaches is 3 words. He says 3 words. It's only 3 words that I'm after, 3 words that I want to preach, and they're not big words. He said, what I want to preach today is all, here, and now. And he talks about we want all our rights. We want our rights here. No, we're not going back to Africa. No, we're not going up north. And we want them right now. And he says, man, if we had to wait for white people to warm up to this issue, man, we as Black people would be in a deep freeze. And so what we have to see is, man, the timidity that some of our white brothers and sisters have, that's not new. But like the Bible would tell us is this: God does not give us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and self-control. One of the things my mama would whisper in my ear every night when I would have nightmares, she would remind me that just because I am fearful, another translation would say, God has not given us a spirit of timidity. So we've got to acknowledge, man, my fear might be because I don't want to put myself in harm's way. That's true. But it takes bravery if we're going to see real transformation. He goes on to bring the church in and how the church has been complicit in this timidity and in this passivity, and why Black power has become this clarion call for many of the young African Americans. He said, it is a disappointment with Christian church that appears to be more white than Christian, and with many white clergymen who prefer to remain silent behind the security of stained glass windows. It is a disappointment, not just with white churches, listen to this now, disappointment with some Negro clergymen who are more concerned about the size of the wheelbase of their automobiles than about the quality of their service to the Negro community. It is a disappointment not just with white people, but it's a disappointment with the Negro middle class that has sailed or struggled out of the muddy ponds into the relatively fresh flowing waters of the mainstream, and in the process has forgotten the stench of the backwaters where their brothers are still drowning. drowning. And so I mean, I want you to get that Dr. King is an equal opportunity offender. Like if anybody thought they were going to get off the hook, you're not getting off the hook in this fight for freedom. Because I know a lot of times in these racial conversations, there's a lot of sense in which it's just white against black. Nah, that's not always the case. As I read The Miseducation of Negroes by Carter G. Woodson, what he talked about? He talked about the miseducation of the Negro pastor and how we are complicit in racism and white supremacy because we have been conditioned to see white people as better than ourselves. And then we in turn hurt those who are under the sound of our voice. I was convicted by that. He goes on to talk about the Negro middle class. Many of you probably don't know about colorism. Colorism, where there have been African Americans who have been light enough to pass as white and therefore abandon those who are African American and deny their heritage. That's a sad reality. And then there have been those who have gained a level of status and achievement and try to avoid at all costs dealing with the pains and the struggles of what it means to be black in America. And so everybody is complicit in this. Nobody gets off the hook in Dr. King's eyes. And so, yeah, Pastor Leon, that's why I love about Dr. King, man. He gonna put everybody in there. Yeah, Doc. Yeah, Doc. I mean, and that's why it's so hard, man. That's why this is so hard. Second, he talked about Black power in its broad and positive meaning is a call to Black people to amass political and economic strength to achieve their legitimate goals. So I got to address this. A lot of times, if you hear conversations with African Americans, a lot of times if you hear you sitting around and you go to a barbershop, for instance, you're going to hear folks talk about we need Black economic power. And he gave a list of all the things we need: political power, we need economic power. We're going to get into the definition of power, but he affirms the fact that as African Americans, we need a power base from which we can exercise our collective voice so that we can get equal rights. And he goes on to say, though, white power has created many things in our society that is used to judge African Americans today. He says the plantation and the ghetto were created by those who had power both to confine those who had no power and to perpetuate their powerlessness. See, so that's why white supremacy and white ideology and white ideals need to be dealt with and addressed, because Dr. King is saying power needs to be used for the benefit of others, not just to oppress others. The problem of transforming the ghetto is therefore a problem of power. So if you drive through West Baltimore, if you drive through my neighborhood I grew up in, Harlem Heights, Dunbar and Fort Myers, if you drive through East Atlanta, Zone 6 in Atlanta, if you drive through and you go, man, that's the hood, that's the ghetto, that's the other side of the tracks. And why haven't these people done anything for themselves? What Dr. King just pulled back was the problem of transforming the ghetto is not all on Black people, but it addresses the fact that, man, the ghetto can't do much because these people are powerless to even change it for themselves. A confrontation between the forces of power demanding change and the forces of power dedicated to preserving the status quo. Power, the definition. So let's get a biblical or a Dr. King, a Kingian definition of power. Power, properly understood, is the ability to achieve purpose. Period. It's the ability to do what I want to do, what I intend to do. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic changes. In this sense, power is not only desirable, but necessary in order to implement the demands of love and justice. So when somebody says, man, as a man, if a woman goes, man, we need woman power. We need we need strength as women. I shouldn't automatically get defensive as a man. I should be going, man, this is what they need to see the ends and to see the goals and the visions that they have realized. So power is not only desirable, but necessary. So everybody needs a sense of power. What is needed is a realization that power without love is what? Reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Let's stop right there. Think about that. Power without love is reckless and abusive. So when we have this autonomy, when we have this power, when it is not balanced out with love, it is reckless and abusive. And we've got to realize that. And then a lot of times Christians, church folks, nice people will go, man, we just need power. We do need power, but love without power is sentimental and anemic. So we just need to love one another. We just need to hug. We just need to just be friends. What's he saying? That's sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. Man, like, listen, I wish white Christians, black Christians, I wish we all had that kind of vision or that understanding of justice. Justice for Ahmaud Arbery, justice for Breonna Taylor, justice for George Floyd. When I say justice, that's what I'm talking about. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. So let's simplify it. What Derek Chauvin, the police officer that murdered George Floyd, what he did was unloving. He was unloving. Or going back to what Jesus said, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And then he goes on to say, so if justice at its best is loving, it is love that is correcting everything that stands against love. Yo, we need that. There's nothing essentially wrong with power. The problem is that in America, power is unequally distributed. And this has led Negro Americans in the past to seek their goals through love and moral suasion, devoid of power, and white Americans to seek their goals through power, devoid of love and conscience. In this struggle for racial justice, a Negro must seek to transform his condition of powerlessness into creative and positive power. And that's true. That's what we need right now. It's not just blanket justice. It's not necessarily even cancel culture, because we ain't even in that. We talking about redemptive power that corrects injustices. Thank you, Pastor Leon, for hanging with us, man. Thank you, Doc. Yeah, you got Bible study. Love what you're hearing and learning. We're in the same place, just a little further down the line. Yes, sir. God bless you, brother. So he goes on to say we need political power, economic power, and personal power. I like what he said when it comes to personal power on page 39. Finally, Black power is psychological call to manhood. For years, the Negro has been taught that he is a nobody, that his color is a sign of biological depravity, that his being has been stamped with indelible imprint of inferiority, that his whole history has been soiled with the filthiness of worthlessness. All too few people realize how slavery and racial segregation have scarred the soul and wounded the spirit of the Black man. The whole dirty business of slavery, based on the premise of the Negro, was a thing to be used and not a person to be respected. And listen, my white brothers and sisters, I need you to understand that psychological warfare is going on right now. That is the thing that I'm currently wrestling through in my own heart, in my own mind. Me. knowing the truth of the gospel, me walking in step with the Spirit, me having a strong Black mother and father who loved me and raised me in the admonition of the Lord, I still struggle with the psychological trauma of racism. That's how deep this goes. Righteousness in a battle with wickedness is evident with power. Within powerful institutions all the way through Proverbs 28 and 29. This is a battle between heaven and hell. That's absolutely right, Dr. Eckel. Josh Kelly saying, insofar as power in a democracy is not implemented in a loving way towards the subgroups within the body, does it remain legitimate? That's a good question, brother. That's a good question. I was just on with a woman. She just told me she works in government in Texas, and she said, I worked in government all my life, and I've had to come to the realization that the government that doesn't work for everyone isn't good. Like if it don't work for everybody, it's not working. And that challenged me. And so, yeah, man, e.g., example in the ghetto example, does the power of the state have legitimate extension into the ghettos? I want to say yes, as it seems to provide the most chance of beneficial change, but facts on the ground seem to say otherwise. All right. So, give me a little bit more. Such a great definition of justice and power. Isn't that a danger of this renewed movement of justice? If it moves devoid of love, absolutely, bro. That's the problem with cancel culture. That's the problem, because it has no redemptive edge. How important is it that the church gets with the program of justice to show a pursuit of justice motivated and governed by love? That's a great question, Eric. And my contention is, we gotta beat it. Like, we gotta have our voice in the game. One of my best examples of this would be Daniel. Daniel worked in corrupt places. He worked under tyrannical regimes, and he was a sense of light, hope, and discernment in the midst of darkness and tyranny. I think about Esther in the Bible, a woman who had clarity in a biblical understanding of the world, of the God of heaven and earth, and so she would speak to the king in such a way as to help him to understand the nuances of what was happening, so as to avoid genocide. And so, yes, as the church, we have to stand up and reclaim these words that we have given to the world. These are biblical words. Dr. King is only pulling from this Hebraic Christian worldview. Dr. Eckel just wrote an awesome article about the Hebraic Christian worldview. Go and check it out. He might tag it in there. But I'm saying we gave these words to the world, and now they've been secularized. And therefore, we've got to reclaim what is naturally ours, because we give the best example of it. But we've got to acknowledge that we've been biased, that we've dropped the ball, and that we fumbled. But we need to reclaim those things. He goes on to say, this probably, and we're going to end on this, probably the hardest part of this chapter was talking about the psychological warfare that racism has done to Black people, because I just struggled with this. And so for my white brothers and sisters, if you're afraid of looking back into history, you got to see how deep this rabbit hole goes and why there is such tension in my own heart and in the hearts of people as we have these conversations, because this thing is deep. It is deep. He talks about the psychological roots. And this is hard for me, because I remember talking to my dad and him helping me to kind of navigate how I would have to be as a man. I remember talking to my mom, and if you've ever seen the movie The Help, that's what my mom did. My mom was a sharecropper. She worked in fields for white people and wasn't treated fairly, never gotten past the third grade education. And so when I say these things, like, there's a deep sense of trauma here. And he brought up real research. That's what I appreciated about it. Historian Kenneth Stamp, in his remarkable book, The Peculiar Institution, he talked about how slave masters went about psychologically breaking Black men and women. He talked about how they broke their will. The slave must know that his master is to govern absolutely, and he is to obey implicitly, and that he is to never, for a moment, to exercise either his will or judgment in opposition to a positive order. Second, We have to rob him of his history. The master felt that they had to implant in the bondsman or the slave a consciousness of personal inferiority. My God. The slave owner, the sense of inferiority was deliberately extended to his past. So in other words, the slave owner created a narrative that you are nothing and you came from nothing. The slave owners were convinced that in order to control the Negroes, the slave had to feel that African ancestry tainted them and that their color was a badge of degradation. The third step in training process was to create a sense of awe of white people. The slave with a sense of the master's enormous power. The fourth aspect was to attempt to persuade the slave to take an interest in the master's enterprise and to accept his standards of good conduct. Man, this is hard because I think about all the times when people told me when I was angry about something, and I was rightly angry, they told me I was acting out of character. And white people told me I had to read books on how to be meek and mild. This was a hard chapter to read for me because as I looked at this, I was like, man, these are the things that are coming up. The final step was to feel his helplessness, to creating them a habit of perfect dependence upon their master. Out of the soil of slavery came the psychological roots of the Black Power cry. What you got, Carl? This chapter made me think about the necessity of collective values. Although we may not be able to operate by consensus, we need values that everyone can buy into. Absolutely. The scary part is the postmodernism happening in our society. How does the church regain a seat at the table? I think we regain a seat at the table by actually doing what we say we're going to do. I think we regain our seat at the table by actually serving, loving, and doing justice. In speaking prophetically into these things and not pulling away from the world, but being salt and light. And that means that we engage. It's not that we create silos and try to hide ourselves from these issues. And what I love about Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement is that they weren't a separate thing, is they saw their walk, their faith influence how they engage with the rest of the world, which is how we're supposed to believe. Dr. Echo put his article in there. I told our staff yesterday the problem the church faces now is that it has the only answer but sits in a post-Christian culture like a backseat driver. That's absolutely right. And we've got to get in front of this thing. Many of those 5 steps of training slaves were so disheartening. Absolutely. And it hurt me. It hurt me. Anyone familiar with the Black Power movement recognizes the defiance of white authority and white power is a constant theme. The defiance almost becomes a kind of taunt. And so the master, and I'll say it like this, it's almost as if the white master sought to become a god in the eyes of the slave. And that's why it's hard, because now when you see these people say we need representation, there's an internal struggle. When you see these Black men and women wear their hair and it's natural, man, that's us fighting for our sense of heritage and dignity and going, man, I don't have to be like white people in order to be accepted and to be the standard of beauty and of life. Right? Keon, the standards of good conduct is so deep. If you look at many of our geographical Black communities, you will see a whole group of people who have rejected what white Americans determines as good conduct. I'm tripping because I remember when I was dating my wife and she worked at what was it? She worked at what's the name? Applebee's, and she talked about how we. When she came to my house, now she really couldn't keep up with how we talked and laughed and how we did all that stuff. She would just sit there quiet with her legs in Indian style on my couch, which you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to put your feet on no Black mom's couch. But she sat there Indian style listening, and she could never quite understand. But over time, she kind of developed a way to kind of navigate through conversation with us. But what she realized is that when we would leave these spaces or go to church, go to wherever, that things would get clearer. And what that is code switching. We've learned how to navigate white and black space. But then she said she was at the restaurant at Applebee's taking orders, and she would talk to African Americans, black folks, and they wouldn't try to make her feel any better. They wouldn't try to help her understand what was being said. And that goes to Keon's point. There are whole groups of us that have said, you know what, we're rejecting all white sensibility. And we're not going to try to appease you and make you feel comfortable. And yeah, that's because we're fighting against that psychological warfare. The black community has been so removed and rejected from society that what is right and proper seems foreign to those outside of the community. That's right. That's right. Yo, cuz, you good? Hey, you ain't got to apologize for being late. We in here just chilling and chopping it up. But here's why I love Dr. King. And how he flips all of that on his head, because he gave the reasons why Black Power is so enticing to African Americans. But he said, man, we do need to resurrect our African past. We need to resurrect it joyously. Black Power advocates contend that the Negro must develop his own sense of strength. Absolutely, we need to do that. Black Power assumes that Negroes will be slaves unless there is a new power to counter the force of the men who will still determine to be masters rather than brothers. That's insightful, because a lot of times when I see people ask me about why do we have to talk about power and why are Black people pursuing power and voting all the time, is because what we see is we don't see people going, man, we want to be your brothers. It feels like people are still determined to be our masters. And so people are fighting vehemently to get a seat at the table. Black Power is a psychological reaction to the psychological indoctrination that led to the creation of the perfect slave. And one must not overlook the positive value in calling the Negro to a new sense of value, a sense of manhood, to a deep feeling of racial pride, and to an audacious appreciation of his heritage. And so, man, it's hard sometimes to say I'm Black and I'm proud because of the indoctrination that something is wrong with me inherently. It's hard for me sometimes as I look at my own kids, and sometimes they prefer to claim to be more like their mother than like me. And it's a great day for me when my son tells me, man, Dad, I want to be more like you than like mommy. Why? Because there's this psychological feeling of, man, I want my son to be proud of the melanin that's in his skin. We need inclusion, not exclusion. No balance. Yeah. So we got all kind of little links and stuff in here. The history books going on. The history books, which have almost completely ignored the contribution of Negro Americans in history, have only served to intensify the Negro's sense of worthlessness and to augment the anachrostic doctrine of white supremacy. African American, for Black folks, we've got to reclaim our sense of history. And for white Americans, you have got to do the homework of knowing the contributions that African Americans have made outside of entertainment and athleticism. And so when we say we need a Black History Month, and why is it that it's the shortest month of the year? And people say, man, well, we don't have a White History Month. If you only knew how demeaning that is for folks, that's hard to hear, because we go, man, we've contributed so much to this nation. This nation would not be what it is without the work, sweat, blood, and tears of Black men and women. And to be overlooked and to be minimized is deep in our society. And then talked about Dr. King going to that musical about music that has made America great. I'm just going to leave that right there. All the students, all the parents, Black and white, all the parents present that night, and all the faculty members had been victimized by just another expression of America's penchant for ignoring the Negro, making him invisible and making his contributions insignificant. And so when we look at George Floyd, when we look at these videos of people dying in the street, there is a collective lament. There is a collective sense of pain that takes place. I wept. Dr. King said, I wept within that night. I wept for my children and all Black children who have been denied the knowledge of their heritage. I wept for all the white children who, through daily miseducation, are taught that the Negro is an irrelevant entity in American society. I wept for all the white parents and teachers who are forced to overlook the fact that the wealth of cultural and technological process in America is a result of the commonwealth of inpouring contributions. And he wept, man. What makes Dr. King weep when you overlook the contributions of Black people and realizing that we've all benefited from this collective history. He goes on further. The tendency to ignore the Negro's contribution to American life and strip him of his personhood is as old as the earliest history books and as contemporary as the morning newspaper. To offset this cultural homicide, and y'all got to be careful because Dr. King is choosing his words wisely. To offset this cultural homicide, the Negro must rise up with an affirmation of his own Olympian manhood. As long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free. The Negro will only be truly free when he reaches down to the inner depths of his own being and signs with an open pen and ink of assertive selfhood his own Emancipation Proclamation. My man Will Brodus brought that up earlier. And so in this regard, man, this Black Power chapter was insightful for me because that's where these movements, that's where these things come from. That's where these conversations. Yeah, identity, Carl, that's right. We need a sense of identity. We need a sense of dignity. We need a sense of pride because we don't have it in a lot of regards. Many of us, I'm even ignorant to a lot of my history. And I hate it sometimes because it feels like the only history we have is slavery. And I know we have so much more to offer than that. And we won't truly be ourselves unless we're able to acknowledge that. Man, it's over an hour already? Yo, why y'all ain't tell me? Why y'all ain't tell me we just been rocking this long, man? I'm just down here rolling. Give me something else. Anything else anybody else saw? Because this was a bit of a long chapter, so I don't want to hold y'all forever. But I love this chapter because it gave a deep insight on where these kinds of slogans come from, and they don't come from a place of pride. They come from a place of pain. And we've got to remember that. But there's also dangers on the opposite end. Like, that's what's so crazy about this is Dr. King is not, he as much as he wants to affirm it, he also has to acknowledge the deep problems with the Black Power slogan. He goes on page 60. I'm going to just jump ahead. Sometimes they talk of overthrowing racist state and local governments. They fail to see that no internal revolution has ever succeeded in overthrowing a government by violence unless government had already lost the allegiance and effective control of its armed forces. So you go on certain blogs, you talk to have certain conversations. There are Black folks that want to have a revolution. Absolutely. Absolutely, they want to have a revolution. They want to overthrow this whole corrupt regime. And they're tired of living under this kind of sense of oppression. But what he is clear about is Dr. King realizes if we go that route, we won't make it. It'll be a fool's errand almost. Few, if any, violent revolutions have been successful unless the violent minority had the sympathy and support of the non-resisting majority. And so that's why it was important that Dr. King approach and appeal to the conscience of white America and not approach and appeal to just fighting them, to disarming and defending ourselves. But he had to disarm them through means of their own conscience so that they would act on behalf of those without the power. It is perfectly clear that a violent revolution on the part of Black Americans, Black would find no sympathy and support from the white population and very little from the majority of the Negroes themselves. This is no time for romantic illusions and empty philosophical debates about freedom. This is a time for action, and we needed a strategy for change, a tactical program that will bring the Negro into the mainstream of America life as quickly as possible. So this was a tactic. This was a thing that was used that was both appealing to the conscience of white America, but also practically useful in the fight for freedom for Americans. Beyond the pragmatic and invalidity of violence, it is its inability to appeal to the conscience. Some Black Power advocates consider an appeal to the conscience irrelevant. And so that's almost like saying, man, well, you can't legislate morality. Well, that's right. You can't change nobody's heart by a law, but you can change how they act. But man, if you appeal to someone's conscience, if their heart is pricked, if their heart is changed, if you can make an enemy into a brother, how much more can we go further together? To hell with the conscience and morality. We want power. But power and morality must go together. Implementing, fulfilling, and ennobling each other. In the quest for power, I cannot bypass the concern for morality. I refuse to be driven to a Machiavellian cynicism with respect to power. Power at its best is the right use of strength. The words of Alfred the Great are still true. Power is never good unless he who has it is good. Nonviolence is power. Let me say that again, because I know it right now we're feeling tension. Like, man, we see protests. We see, man, we want to loot. We want to riot. We want to do all these things. And we have a level there. I have a level of anger and rage in my heart. This Sunday in my church, I'm preaching on anger and the pain that I feel on the inside. What? But nonviolence is power. But it is the right and good use of power. Constructively, it can save the white man as well as the Negro. Man, that's powerful right there. Exactly, cuz people see the act and not the why. People see the what. Isn't that what the lady said on the video? People see the what and not the why. When you hear defund the police, they're reacting to the pain. Abolish the police, reacting to the pain. But I always say, yo, don't make decisions. Don't make big decisions, when you're bored, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. And it sounds like right now we're getting a whole lot of angry people trying to make big decisions. And so that I think we can have a little bit more clarity. We can seek reform, we can seek change, and we don't have to be sensational to do that. Dr. King's approach wasn't sensational, but it was practical and effective. But I love how he addressed white guilt, because I fear a lot of people have a lot of white guilt, and I see it a lot. The apologies, the kind of tension, the stuttering when we talk, all these kinds of things. And he goes on to say, a guilt-ridden white minority feels that if the Negro attains power, he will, without restraint or pity, act to revenge the accumulated injustices and brutality of the years. And that's, I think, is a fear. Because I talked to one of my family members this week, and he was like, cuz, I know a lot of our people don't know our history, and I fear that if a lot of young people, if young Black men and women understood the brutality of our history, the things that we suffered, he fears that they won't have the moral balance to not go by their most base emotions and feelings and seek retaliation. And I think that when we look at guilty people that feel a sense of guilt and shame for the history, they don't want to pay the price for something they didn't do. But there's this assumption that there will be just a sense of revenge and not equality and love. The problem with hatred and violence is that they intensify the fears of the white majority and leave them ashamed of their prejudices towards Negroes. In the guilt and confusion confronting our society, violence only adds to the chaos. It deepens the brutality of the oppressor and increases the bitterness of the oppressed. Violence is the antithesis of creativity and wholeness. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. And so I think, man, we need a sense in which we need a new imagination. Like, we need a new imagination where this ain't just based on some kind of crazy power struggle and some major power play that says, man, if these people gain freedom and equality and justice, that then it's going to mean a loss for me. I said that last week, where we don't fear change, we fear loss. And so Dr. King is saying, man, if we go after this, violence is the antithesis against creativity and wholeness. So I know for some of us, for African Americans, we look at a place like Wakanda. If you've seen the movie Black Panther, and we're looking at Wakanda like, yeah, that's what we want. So that we want to overthrow, and we can identify. I know a lot of my friends that were Black Panther 3 weeks ago, and this week they Killmonger, if you know the movie. And what happens? Violence is the antithesis of creativity and wholeness. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. I don't want to demean somebody else. I don't want somebody else to be oppressed. I want us all to be free. I want us all to enjoy the justices that was promised to us. Yeah, man, Eric, you're right. So interesting. The Beatitudes says the meek will inherit the earth, and we busy trying to inherit the earth by force, divorced from love. That's absolutely right. Man, we need a new imagination. We need a new vision of what it could look like to live together. No more colonizers. That's right. There you go with that Killmonger stuff right there. Man. So in closing, because y'all know I'm an introvert, so doing this with y'all, I love it, but this thing makes me sleepy, so I'm about to be on E. Y'all see how I just made that whole pause because I was like, oh, Charlie, you in too deep right now. But I love hanging out with y'all, by the way, so thanks for coming and rocking with me. Humanity is waiting for something other than blind imitation of the past. And I think that's important for us to remember right now, is we're not just trying to repeat the past. We're not trying to pick up skills that were given to us in the past. We're not trying to recreate the brutalities of the past. If we want to truly advance a step further, if we want to turn over a new leaf and really set a new man afoot, we must begin to turn mankind away from the long and desolate night of violence. May it not be that the new man the world needs is the nonviolent man. Longfellow said, in this world, a man must either be an anvil or a hammer. We must be hammers shaping a new society rather than anvils molded by the old. And in the way Paul the Apostle would say is our minds need to be transformed. Like, we can no longer be conformed to the ways of the world, but we need to be renewed. Our minds need to be renewed. And so he's saying the exact same thing. We don't need to be shaped by the old. We need to be hammers carving out a new world. Not only will it make us new men, but it will give us a new kind of power. So there's not just two ways, violence or nonviolence, Republican or Democrat, rioting or peaceful protest. It's not just two ways. He's saying there's another way. There's a new kind of power. It's not. It will not be Lord Acton's image of power that tends to corrupt or absolute power that corrupts absolutely. It will be power infused with love and justice that will change dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows and lift us from the fatigue of despair to the buoyance of hope. Man, I love Dr. King. He's got a way with words. A dark, desperate, confused, and sin-sick world waits for the new kind of man and this new kind of power. I don't know if you've seen the commentary about our president. I don't know if you've seen the rhetoric they use for people in the streets. I don't know if you've seen the fear and the confusion in a lot of people's hearts and minds, but it sounds like to me Dr. King was on to something. Sounds like we need a new kind of man. not one that's willing to settle for how things have always been, but somebody that's willing to fight for a different tomorrow. We don't need the same old, same old. We don't need a remixed version of the old. We need a new kind of man that wields a new kind of power. And so, man, I'm challenged by Dr. King in this regard, because as much as I would like to rail and rage against the machine, man, I can't rage against the machine at the cost of my white brother. And I hope that my white brother isn't so defensive and isn't so fearful of the other that he wouldn't be willing to hear from his broken brother. So that we need a new kind of power. We need a new kind of conversation, one that's just not one-sided where we're trying to make our point, but one where we create a whole new situation. Now, I know I'm a Christian, so I don't think all of this is going to happen overnight. Matter of fact, I don't know if all this stuff is going to get worked out in my lifetime or in the lifetime to come. I pray a lot of it does, but that's the hope. And it's my job to do a little something better today, to leave the world better today than it was when I got here. And I hope that we can do that as we engage with Dr. King's work. And so listen, man, thank y'all for joining me, hanging out with me tonight. I hope this has been powerful. It's been impactful for you. Dr. King's words are so prophetic and relevant to our current situation. Man, share the book with friends and family. Give the quote, share these quotes, do all that kind of stuff with people, because, man, I think he's helping me to rethink a lot of my own instincts and feelings in this season right now. And to know that he's gone through these dark days before. This ain't nothing new. That all right, some kind of way we can navigate it. But being reminded that this is dangerous and hard work. This is dangerous and hard work. And so this is a long journey. This ain't just one conversation. This ain't just going to be one phone call. This is a long journey that we're giving ourselves to. So thank you for walking with me in it. So next Thursday night, 9 p.m. Racism and the White Backlash. Dr. King went in this last week. He went in this last week on Black Power, and he parsed it and he sliced and diced it. For my white brothers and sisters, next week, we're about to look at the white backlash and racism. And I already got highlighted in my book. I'm gonna just prepare you for next week. I already got it highlighted. He who lives with untruth lives in spiritual slavery. It's going to be a good conversation next week. So I'm excited. I'm excited to look through it. Hopefully y'all will join me. I already got a bunch of stuff highlighted. I'm going to read it again this week. And we're going to walk through this thing again together next week. So invite a friend. If you invited somebody, I got a bunch of people that's kind of in the waiting room. But if you invited somebody to it and you ain't never seen them in the group, make sure that they answer the questions. All right? Make sure they answer the questions so we can bring them on in. Listen, you don't have homework. So I got people that say, I'm sorry, I missed it. I'm late. I'm doing this. Ain't class. You ain't gonna get no college credit. I mean, if you want to pay me as a professor, I'll take it. Cash App, whatever, Venmo, I'll take it. But I'm just joking on that. But tell people, man, come join. We got almost 130 people in this book club together. So invite folks. We got another 4 weeks that we're gonna walk through this stuff together. We're gonna walk through this particular book together, and I'm so excited to do it together with you. So love y'all, and I'll see y'all next week. Peace.